All right, well, welcome everybody to Module 4. Congratulations on being 3/8 of the way through the course. That's great. We have our first exam coming up in 2 weeks, so we'll want to be preparing for that. Probably by the end of this week, I'll have some possible essay questions for you to study. In addition to your IDs, you should be studying your IDs as well. I should also mention that our extra reading this week is The Cherry Orchard by Anton Chekhov. Would have been better last module, but we'll make it work. It's a fun story. So we'll be talking about that next week, next Friday, and then you guys will be released to your exam. I'll have more to say about that, of course, on announcements. So we're looking forward to this module, which again will focus on the peasantry. We'll focus on the relationship between certain Russians and the peasantry and their conceptions of the peasantry. We'll also be looking at the love story between these intellectuals and the peasantry. But we're also going to be finding that they fell out of love to some degree. By the end of the period with the peasants, in part because of the inexplicable nature of the peasantry. So we'll talk about that, and we'll enjoy ourselves this time around. And I look forward to working through it with all of you. All right. We begin this story with the peasant marriage in the middle of the 19th century. We'll start with the so-called Narodniki. The Narodniki were the so-called populists who, in the early 1870s, decided that as young, educated people, they needed to go into the countryside and they needed to work with the peasantry to try to enlighten them about what was best for them, for their future. These populists, of course, saw this as their own kind of pilgrimage to the peasantry, and thousands of them went out into the countryside. And hundreds of them ended up being arrested, turned over to the authorities, in part because the peasantry couldn't understand what they were about. And as you can see in this painting, which was done by Ilya Repin, you can see that the young Narodnik here, the populist, surrounded by the peasantry in a village somewhere or in some building somewhere, but nonetheless the Narodnik here has had his suitcase opened up and filled with pamphlets and various other kinds of educational materials. Interestingly, what happened with these Narodniki was that after 2 years, 1873 and 1874, their movement kind of died. And we'll be talking about that in this chapter. A very interesting kind of part of this story, which of course was preceded in 1861 by the emancipation of the serfs. We've talked about that. But it was the emancipation, really, as much as anything, which required some people, like the Narodniki, the populists, to go out into the people and to try to not only educate them, but also benefit from them. Because they understood the Narod, the word Narod in Russian means the people. The Narod, they understood to be the peasantry, and they understood the peasants, of course, to be natural socialists. And so these populists, these Narodniki, of course, thought that they could take advantage, if you will, of the socialist nature of the people, and so they tried to educate them as far as that went. Turgenev, of course, is also a part of this story. You'll recall, of course, from Fathers and Sons that he had a lot to say about the peasantry, even if implicitly. I've mentioned his book called The Sportsman's Sketches, which was published in the late 1840s, 1849, I believe. You've already read Fathers and Sons. And of course, you can see that there was a lot of interest on the part of these people in the peasantry. One of the points that Figes makes in his analysis is that every analysis or every answer is and an interesting point that Figus makes about all of this is that regardless of how whomever in this chapter saw the peasantry, every way in which they saw them, every answer, as it were, was in some way a myth. Not true, but yet important for the purposes of constructing Russian national consciousness. Of course, that's not what the people who were in the process of making these myths said, but or understood, I should say. But that indeed is the truth. And of course, we should also keep in mind that this story is also a kind of illustration about the service ethic which still resided in people, and in particular in the kind of people that went into the countryside. And of course, again, what they're trying to do here is they're trying to both educate the populace, but also learn from them. Thinking, of course, that communism, I should say, thinking that the peasantry was, shall we say, the home of socialism and community. Another part of the story that we're going to be looking at, of course, is the neo-nationalist school. We're going to be looking some more at some of the artists we were introduced to last time, and indeed Ilya Repin will still be a part of that story. This is his very famous painting, the Volga Barge Haulers, done in 1873. It is an example of the realism of the age. If you look closely, of course, at the picture, you see a number of people who are hauling a barge as though they were animals, really. And of course, what Repin has at the center of this picture is an argument about human dignity. There is in this picture nothing that's idealized, nothing that's romanticized. This is what we call realism. And Dostoevsky would, of course, say it was an epic portrait of the Russian character, in part because, as Figus argues, this is a picture about the private suffering of individual people. But it's also a portrait of the character of Russian people, which means, of course, that in their suffering, in their capacity to suffer, in their capacity to bear up under the burdens of life, the Russian character is brought out and it is illustrated. Figus says their bondage was a symbol of the Russian people's oppressed creativity, the human dignity that stands out above all. And this is how realism works. Realism seeks to paint a picture of reality that in between the lines or under the surface essentially argues that the reality that the people are suffering is a reality that is unjust, that is unfair, that needs to be changed, and it's a kind of a paradox, if you will, that doing realist paintings, painting things just like they look, so to speak, would in fact influence people to see what was going on under the surface, as opposed to, say, pictures like this by Alexei Venetsianov, which are more idealized, they're more sentimentalized, they're more individualized, and in all of those respects, they are more democratic, whereas a picture like this is, less democratic. You see the people as a group, And so all of those kinds of values we will be talking about. Here's another example of realist painting in the 1870s, this one by Konstantin Zawitsky called Repairing the Railroad. And you can see that this also is a kind of civic realism that the wanderers, the peredvizhniki, the neo-nationalists were producing. And of course, if you look carefully at it, yeah, you see a lot of people working. But what you see is a lot of people working in ways that are indicative, not of their creativity or of their greatness or their intelligence or, for that matter, their individuality, but rather indicative of the fact that they are essentially downtrodden, that they are essentially being made to work too hard on projects that were too hard and too difficult. So realism is a very interesting genre, if you ask me. Personally, I like realism a great deal, but of course in realism you always have to look underneath the surface. Here is yet another massive painting by Repin, the religious procession in Kursk province. And again, what you see here is you don't just see military people and religious leaders and icons, but of course you see regular people, including the most downtrodden, the ones in the front, for instance, that have canes. And there's a certain elemental, shall we say, a certain elemental reality here. Of course, the other thing that's interesting in this picture is the scale, the sheer scale. You can even see the dust being kicked up, as it were. And so this procession, which was massive, and therefore indicative of the orthodoxy of the peasantry, and the communalism of the peasantry, you can see that again there's a kind of way that realism can communicate these kinds of things. It's really pretty interesting. Another one of the neo-nationalist artists that's talked about in this chapter is Mark Antokolsky, who was Jewish, and in his work as a sculptor, he sought to portray the daily life of the Jewish ghetto and the difficulties that the Jewish people had. And so this was another example, shall we say, of this. Repin, of course, painted Mussorgsky, that very famous painting, which you've already seen. And of course, we've come across Mussorgsky, and we're back with him again. Today, or this week, I should say this module, we're going more technically into his music, in the sense that we're going to talk about and read about how it was constructed, how it borrowed from the peasantry, how it borrowed from essentially non-Russian instrumentality and tonality and rhythms, all of which, of course, were purposely designed to mine the Russian national soul. And in Mussorgsky's case, and of course in the case of others that we'll be talking about also, under the leadership, under the under the guidance of Stasov, Repin and Mussorgsky and Antolsky and others, were engaged in this process of, shall we say, mining the peasantry for as much as they possibly could. Ivan Kramskoy is another person who's mentioned in the chapter. Notice that if you look at his paintings, there's a kind of psychological concentration that draws viewers into the inner world who had only recently been slaves. That is to say, these are former serfs, now free. But you can see the very vivid nature of their faces, and the argument here is that you're being asked to move into that inner world. I'm pretty sure that the fellow in the center is Jesus. I'm pretty sure that he is probably in his 40-day wilderness suffering, is my guess, although I don't know much about the provenance of the picture. But again, you are being asked to enter into a kind of inner world, a contemplative world, that is important in all of this. We've talked a lot about Vladimir Stasov, and this is two pictures of him, this critic, Vladimir Stasov, who was the impresario of the Russian National School and of this utilitarian and thought-provoking art that we've been talking about. And an interesting part of the story that we'll read about in this chapter is the way that not only he built this national school, but also how in many respects the national school kind of ran its course. Some of the artists fell out of love with the peasantry, as we will see, including Repin. And so this is a part of the story that not only tells us how they loved the peasantry, but also how they fell out of love with the peasantry for a lot of different reasons. And these questions will be central to our discussion, of course. And then also in this chapter, we're going to have a sizable portion of it devoted to Leo Tolstoy, of course, the great Russian writer of War and Peace and Anna Karenina and many other books. A great pacifist as far as that goes, a kind of non-religious, religious thinker, as it were. We'll be exploring some of the depths of his life, including his life at Yasnaya Polyana, this place where he lived and died, which, by the way, was once owned by the Volkonsky family, who were cousins of Tolstoy. And Tolstoy's story will interestingly coincide or be woven together with the story of the peasant marriage. And so even though we don't have, pictures of the peasant marriage here, let's keep in mind that the peasant marriage itself is, it's a very important part of our story. And then finally, we're going to be talking about these fellows, Dyagilev, Stravinsky, and Nijinsky, who will almost move past the peasantry. They're a part of the story that kind of takes us into the Soviet period. But these people will move from more classical, realist portrayals of Russian art, and they will move much more toward the peasant avant-garde. So, with that briefer introduction to the module than the two previous introductions that you had, we'll go ahead and we'll move forward. Again, I'm looking forward to this stuff. It's very interesting, and we'll see you soon.